All right, Crim 20, we're going to knock out chapter 8. And this is going to be a chapter, obviously, you can probably read that yourselves, about the juvenile correctional system. And there is a pretty significant difference between the juvenile correctional system and the adult correctional system. And what I like to do, and what I, obviously COVID has changed some things for us, but I like to suggest that people take both my Crim 20 class and Crim 11 class and take a tour of both the Juvenile Justice Campus, which is our local juvenile hall here down at 99 and American Avenue. And for this class, Crim 20, we would typically take a tour of the Fresno County Jail. Obviously, again, those are not options. Not going to be an option for quite some time, I'm guessing, but that used to be our extra credit assignment. And it just amazing the difference between the two facilities. And again, I really wish that we were back to where we were so that you could actually see it for yourselves. But juveniles, what is a juvenile? For purposes of the law in California, a juvenile in the court system is anyone under 18 years old. Under 18 years old. And I'm going to say that again because I may ask you that question on a quiz. Under 18, not 18 and under, but under 18. So, once you hit 18, you are no longer a juvenile, the day you turn 18. There are some kind of myths and maybe some, common myths that a lot of us would believe that juvenile violent crime is on the rise. And actually, it is not. Over the past 2 decades, so 20 years or so, juvenile violent crime has been on the decline. Why is that? I don't know that we really know why that is. I think that violent crime in general has gone down. It's kind of hard to even fathom saying that right now when we are living in the city of Fresno. And we are seeing the insanity that is going on this year, 2020. I'm recording this in 2020 in the city of Fresno because our shootings and homicides are up quite significantly this year. 2020 is an anomaly. It is an insane year. I think we would all agree that this is not a normal year and that things have been pretty significantly different than like I said, than the norm. So, but juvenile violent crime has been down. A status offense. What is a status offense? Okay, so a status offense is basically a crime that is only illegal because of a person's age. So let me give you an example of what that means. So, say for example, let's say I have a 16-year-old daughter. And my 16-year-old daughter is out walking around the streets at 2 o'clock in the morning, and Fresno PD rolls up on her. And she's by herself, and they contact her. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. She's 16, by herself, walking down the street. Is there a problem? Yes, there's a problem. Why? Because she's 16, she's not an adult, and she's walking around in the middle of the night by herself. It's against the law. Right? It's a status offense. You cannot be out past curfew if you are underage. It's only illegal because of your age. Imagine same scenario, except I, this 40-something-year-old woman, am walking around by myself in the middle of the night in the city of Fresno. Is there a problem? No, I might be crazy, but there's no legal issue because I am not a juvenile, so there is no status offense. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about a status offense. It's something that's only illegal because of your age. This kind of talks about the development of the juvenile justice system throughout the United States. So what I would say is many years ago, juveniles and adults were treated exactly the same. If you were a juvenile and you got arrested for theft, you were housed in the same type of facility that an adult was. You were treated in the same court system as an adult. There came a time when, kind of back in this area, in the House of Refuge area, when some people came to the United States they were the Quakers, You've probably heard of them in your American history. They were a religious group, and the Quakers believed that juveniles should be treated differently than adults because they didn't know any better. They were younger. They needed to be taught how to do things. They were children. So how could we treat them like adults? So it was during that time we kind of started saying like, hey, why are we treating these little people like they're adults and they should know the same things that adults should know? It took all the way until 1899 before we had our first juvenile court system, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Before that time, men, women, and children were all housed in jails together, and they were all treated exactly the same in the court systems. That's probably something I'm going to ask you on a quiz. Have juveniles always been treated differently than adults? No, not always. They have been for a long time now, but not always. Parens patriae, another thing I might ask you about. And yes, I have a silly way to describe this, but it helps me to really remember it. Parens patriae was a concept that started in England, and basically the King of England was frustrated that there were so many children that were running the streets whose parents were not caring for them, and the children were getting arrested and not being cared for. So the King of England decided to step in and basically take charge of those children. He was acting as the parent on behalf of the parent of the nation. He said, I am taking over as your parent since your parents are not taking care of business. What I like to say now, how do we use that now in the United States? Here's my informal way of saying it, which will help you remember. I know it's silly. Don't use this in other classes, but I say the court is your daddy. The court steps in and makes decisions on behalf of the child because the parent can't do it or isn't doing it. And we still use this today. The courts will step in and make decisions on behalf of the child today. In the 1970s is when we started with the whole concept of deinstitutionalization of status offenders. What does deinstitutionalization? That's like the longest word ever. But it means just what it sounds like, taking something out of an institution. When we're talking about institutions in this class, typically we're talking about a correctional institution, a jail, a juvenile hall, a correctional facility of some sort. So it was in about the 1970s that we decided that it was time to have runaways and, as they called them, incorrigible youth, just kids that weren't behaving at home, take them out of the juvenile halls. Because what we were doing prior to that was putting runaways in the same facilities with juveniles that were murderers. What happens when you put a runaway in a cell with a murderer? There's a couple things that can happen. The murderer kills the runaway, or the murderer teaches the runaway how to be a murderer, right? Either way, it's bad. So it was about that time when we started realizing, hey, we need to separate the serious offenders from the not so serious offenders. So this is kind of, we're kind of going through time and kind of morphing into where we are now. 1990s. This was the crack era. Yes, you were all waiting for me to get to the crack era. Those of you who've happy for other classes know that I pretty much talk about the crack era in every class, and it was one of my favorite, it's my favorite era to talk about because it was such a crazy time. And I used to like saying it was like the craziest time I'd ever lived through, but now I have lived through COVID, so I don't know that I can say that the crack era was the craziest time. But anyways, the crack era was insane. There was so much violent crime during that time, and during that time, there was this guy who kind of started this movement and a belief that we were going to have these super predator youth. We were going to have young people, minors, juveniles, who were going to go out and commit these ridiculously horrific, violent crimes. And honestly, it scared the community. And it scared the community into starting to really focus on harsh punishment for juveniles. So we started to treat juveniles a little bit more like adults again. That adultification. So we started doing things like sending kids to adult court. They call that a waiver to adult court. If a juvenile goes to an adult court for their proceedings, they call that a waiver. In California, we call that a fitness hearing, which is, we still use in California, but not nearly as much as we did back here in probably the 90s and the early 2000s. We used it a lot. We're kind of pulling back from this now, and certainly in California we are, and starting to treat juveniles like juveniles again. But typically a juvenile would have to commit a pretty violent crime in order to get to the adult world. But anyways, you can kind of see the pendulum swings, and throughout time it kind of goes back and forth between harsh punishment for juveniles and then not so harsh punishment. So where do we go from here? Delinquency and dependency. There are two types of court for youth. A delinquency court deals with a young person who has committed a law violation. So anyone under 18 who has committed a law violation, broken the law, is going to be in a delinquency court. Anyone under 18 who has either an absent or abusive or neglectful parent, and they make their way to court for that, is going to be in a dependency court. I call this kind of like a CPS court, dependency. And delinquency court, I usually would call that like a probation court. Those are kind of informal ways that I kind of remember them. So delinquency court, you're talking about kids who have broken the law. Dependency court, you're talking about kids usually who need intervention because their parents are lacking or absent. Age of original jurisdiction. This is interesting about California, and again, I wish we were in person so we could talk about this stuff in person, because it makes it so much more fun when I ask you, what do you think the lowest age is that a young person can get arrested in California? And I'll get all kinds of interesting answers, but in California there is no specific lower end to the age range. Now, does that mean there's 5-year-olds sitting in juvenile hall? No. But there is no written in the law books lower end in California. Right now, the upper age is the day before you turn 18. Day before you turn 18. I believe Governor Newsom is trying to get that changed to let them be older. But we shall see. We shall see. But the age range for a juvenile, there is no low age. Ultimately, a juvenile has to be able to understand the difference between right and wrong in order to be charged with crime. And then the upper age is 17. So like I said, the day they turn 18, they go to adult court. Juvenile justice process, kind of similar to the adult process. There's a crime occurs, of course. There's an arrest or citation. Either they're taken into custody or they're given a ticket, like we would see for adults. The difference here is a police report gets written. In the juvenile world, instead of going straight from arrest, police report, going to the DA, it stops at probation first in the juvenile world. So probation is really heavily involved in the juvenile world, the whole justice process. A probation officer will read the police report and decide if that police report goes to the DA's office for formal charges. Which seems kind of weird, right? Because you would think it would go straight to the prosecuting attorney's office, but it doesn't. So probation is very heavily involved in the juvenile court system, which is why I worked in the juvenile courts as a probation officer, which is, again, kind of weird and interesting. Another thing that you can do if you're a probation officer, I worked in a courtroom for 8 years. So I was fortunate enough, and I loved the courts, so it was another really interesting thing that I got to do. If the intake probation officer thinks the charges are serious enough, they'll send them to the DA's office. The DA will file charges, and the court proceedings begin. Court process, kinda, again, similar to the adult process, except for it goes much faster, much faster. They don't want children to be sitting in juvenile hall for years. Children need to get in and out. They want them to get back to school, back to, a year in the life of a 15-year-old is a lot different than a year in the life of a 35-year-old. So they want them to get back to normalcy as soon as possible. So during their first court hearing, it would be a detention or arraignment. The court will address whether or not they're going to stay in custody in juvenile hall. The juvenile will enter an admission or a denial. You'll see I didn't say guilty or not guilty. The words are a little different. That's the same thing. This is a plea. They could be deferred or sent to a, oh shoot, the word's gonna, of course, not come to my mind right now. Diversion, yes, there we go. Whew. Or get set for trial. And typically, if a juvenile is in custody, their case from the day they get arrested until it goes to trial the trial will be set within 1 month. Maybe even sooner. You know how the adult process goes. It can take years before the trial is set. Juvenile court process, very fast, very short timelines, and I mentioned why. After a denial is entered, and that's basically a not guilty plea, they will have a hearing where the prosecutor, this usually would takes place about a week later. Prosecutor, defense attorney, and judge will try and work out a plea agreement for the minor. About a week later. If there's no resolution, the matter is set for adjudication, which is the same thing as a trial. Okay? They call them different things. Once the case is resolved, either through a plea deal or an adjudication or trial, the matter is set for disposition. That means sentencing. It's the same thing. Okay? Dispositional alternatives or sentencing options. They can do informal probation. And this is basically a diversion type program. They can do formal diversion, which is kind of the same thing as informal. Formal probation. Short-term commitment. This could be, 30 days in juvenile hall. A long-term commitment, maybe a year in juvenile hall. Camps or ranches. Remember, maybe we didn't really talk. We used to have a boot camp program out here in Fresno. Valley Teen Ranch, you probably heard of that. It's another one. Group homes. We have a lot of group homes in our areas. Or CDCR DJJ, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, DJJ, Division of Juvenile Justice. This is like a prison for kids. This is the thing that I think that oh no, it wasn't this class, it was my other class. Yeah, that's going to be a good discussion question. Ding, just got an idea for next week, yay. Okay. The vast majority of juvenile offenders are under probation supervision in the community and they are not detained. Remember, deinstitutionalization. We are trying to get them back in the community. We don't want to lock up the offenders, juvenile offenders. We think it's better to have them in the community. There have been a lot of cases over a period of time, over a long period of time, that allowed for juveniles to finally basically get almost all the same rights in court that adults have. In Ray Galt in 1967 was the first case that really started that process. Juveniles didn't even have the right to have an attorney before this. So baby steps, little by little, over time, juveniles were able to get almost all the same protections that adults have in the court process. There are two things I can think of. Juveniles do not have the right to bail, and juveniles do not have the right to have a jury trial. Other issues with juvenile delinquents, of course, gangs. And these are also issues with adults. Mental health, also issues with adults, and drugs also. So none of these, I think, should be surprises to you. And that was it. We made it. Less than 20 minutes.